Picture this. September 1944. A Panther tank, 45 tons of sloped steel, prowling through the fog near Arracourt, France. German commanders believed this machine was untouchable from the front. They'd seen American Shermans bounce shells off that glacis plate like pebbles against a fortress wall. To them, the Panther was invincible, a technological masterpiece that would crush any Allied tank foolish enough to face it head-on. Then something impossible happened. A Sherman 76mm gun fired from nearly 2,000 yards away. The round screamed through the morning mist, a tungsten penetrator moving at 3,400 feet per second. It punched clean through the Panther's turret like it was paper. Flames erupted. The crew inside never knew what hit them. German tank commanders watching from nearby ridges stood frozen in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to be possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Their intelligence had assured them that American tanks couldn't penetrate Panther armor at long range. They'd been told the Sherman was inferior, a death trap manned by inexperienced crews. But now, Panther after Panther was burning across the fields of Lorraine, and the weapon causing this carnage? A rocket-shaped shell that most German officers had never even heard of. The HVAP round, high-velocity armor-piercing, had just arrived in France, and it was about to rewrite everything the Wehrmacht thought they knew about American firepower. When the Sherman first rolled into combat in 1942, it was more than adequate for the job. In North Africa, its 75mm gun could punch through the frontal armor of German Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs at normal combat ranges. American tankers felt confident. The Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and available in numbers the Germans could never match. But war has a way of evolving faster than anyone expects. By 1943, the Germans had learned hard lessons on the Eastern Front. The answer was the Panther, a medium tank that weighed as much as a heavy. Its frontal glacis plate measured 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees. That angle made it effectively impervious to most Allied guns. The 75mm K-Ball K-42 gun it carried could kill a Sherman from over 2,000 meters. To American tankers encountering it for the first time in Normandy, the Panther seemed like a nightmare made steel. Intelligence reports filtering back to Allied command painted a grim picture. The standard 75mm Sherman gun couldn't penetrate the Panther's front at any range. Crews were instructed to flank, to aim for the sides and rear where armor was thinner, but flanking maneuvers required time, coordination, and often cost lives. Tank crews began to fear Panther encounters. They knew that in a head-on duel, they were outmatched. The U.S. Ordnance Department had seen this coming. Even before the Panther appeared, engineers were working on a better gun for the Sherman. The result was the 76mm M1, a longer-barreled weapon with higher velocity than the original 75. The first 76mm Shermans were ready by early 1944, but when they arrived in Britain before D-Day, commanders weren't impressed. The new gun had problems. Its muzzle blast kicked up enormous dust clouds that obscured the gunner's view. The high-explosive shell it fired was less effective than the 75mm version, and most damning of all, when tested against captured German tanks, the 76mm standard armor-piercing round still couldn't reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor. General George Patton initially rejected the 76mm Shermans, so did other commanders. They argued that the 75mm gun was good enough for infantry support and that specialized tank destroyers should handle enemy armor. So the 76mm Shermans sat in depots, unwanted and unused, while the invasion of Normandy proceeded with the standard 75mm models. Then came the battles in the bocage, hedgerow country, where Panthers could hide in ambush behind every tree line. American tank losses mounted. Units reported that they couldn't fight Panthers effectively. By late July, during Operation Cobra, commanders were desperately calling for the 76mm Shermans they'd rejected just months before. The first 76mm Shermans entered combat on July 25, 1944. 102 M4A1 tanks with the new gun arrived in France. But even with the longer gun, they discovered a harsh truth. The standard M62 armor-piercing round still couldn't crack a Panther from the front, except at suicidal ranges. General Eisenhower was furious when he learned the truth. Ordnance had told him the 76mm would handle anything the Germans had. Now he found that it couldn't knock out the one tank his forces feared most. Reports came back from units that had fired multiple rounds at Panthers with no effect. The 76mm was better than the 75, yes, but against the Panther it still fell short. Testing conducted at Isigny, France, in August of 1944 confirmed the worst fears. Engineers fired captured American and British weapons at abandoned Panthers to determine what worked and what didn't. The 76mm M62 armor-piercing round failed to penetrate the front hull at any distance. It could penetrate the turret mantlet at very close range, but only with perfect shot placement from inside 300 yards. The American tanker's reality was brutal. If you encountered a Panther, you had three choices: flank it and hope you could get a side shot before it killed you, call in artillery or air support and pray they arrived in time, or retreat and let someone else deal with it. None of these options inspired confidence. German commanders watched American efforts with contempt and satisfaction. Their intelligence gathered reports of American complaints about the Sherman's gun. To the Germans, this confirmed what they already believed. German engineering was superior. The Panther was proof that quality could overcome quantity. But unknown to most soldiers in the field, and to most German intelligence officers, American engineers had been working on something else. Something that didn't require a new tank or even a new gun, just a new type of ammunition. A shell that used a tungsten carbide penetrator surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body. The HVAP round was coming, and it would turn the tables in ways no one had predicted. The HVAP concept adapted British ideas about sub-caliber projectiles. Instead of firing a large, heavy projectile, fire a small, dense penetrator at extremely high velocity. Wrap it in a lightweight sabot that falls away after leaving the barrel, allowing the penetrator core to fly faster and hit harder than any conventional shell. American engineers adapted this concept for the 76mm gun. The resulting round, designated T4 and later standardized as M93, was a technological marvel. The projectile weighed only about 10 pounds compared to 15 for the M62 round, but inside that lightweight package was a core of tungsten carbide, one of the hardest materials available. When fired, the HVAP round left the barrel at 3,400 feet per second. That was nearly 600 feet per second faster than the standard armor-piercing round, where the M62 could penetrate roughly 4.3 inches of armor at 1,000 meters. The HVAP could punch through 7 inches. That difference was enough to defeat the Panther's turret armor at ranges previously considered safe by German crews. The physics behind it were straightforward but devastating. Armor penetration depends on kinetic energy. Energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. That squared term is crucial. The HVAP sacrificed some mass for much higher velocity, and the math worked decisively in its favor. The tungsten core concentrated all that kinetic energy into a tiny impact point. Testing showed the HVAP could penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet reliably at ranges up to 500 yards. The turret face and sides, which German crews thought were safe from Sherman fire at combat ranges, were now penetrable. The psychological equation was about to flip. But there was a catch. Tungsten carbide was a strategic material, desperately needed for machine tools and other industrial applications. The United States had limited supplies. Production couldn't match demand. Initial manufacturing runs were small, prioritized for tank destroyer units rather than tank battalions. The first 2,000 HVAP rounds for the 76mm gun arrived in France by air delivery in August 1944. They were distributed primarily to tank destroyer battalions. On September 18th, near Luneville, France, M18 Hellcats engaged German Panthers for the first time with HVAP ammunition. The results stunned both sides. 8 Panthers were destroyed with no American losses. Tank destroyer crews watched in disbelief as their shells, which previously would have bounced off, now punched clean through. Word spread quickly among American armored units. The new ammunition worked, but frustration mounted as tank battalions learned that the miracle ammunition existed but wasn't reaching them. By February of 1945, the average 76mm Sherman had received only 5 HVAP rounds total. German intelligence initially dismissed reports of the new American ammunition. It seemed impossible that a gun as small as the 76mm could threaten a Panther at medium range. But as more Panthers were lost to frontal hits at distances exceeding 500 meters, doubt crept in. Something had changed. By September of 1944, 2 crucial events were about to collide. The German 5th Panther Army was preparing a major counter-offensive in Lorraine, and in American supply depots, small quantities of HVAP ammunition were finally reaching forward units, including some attached to the 4th Armored Division. The stage was set for the Battle of Arracourt. The terrain around Arracourt was tank country, gently rolling hills, scattered woods, small villages. It was the kind of open ground where the Panther's long-range gun should have dominated. German commanders knew this. When they planned their counter-offensive, they counted on the terrain working in their favor. The German force assembled for the attack was formidable. 5th Panzer Army committed the 111th Panzer Brigade and elements of the 11th Panzer Division, totaling 182 tanks, including 107 Panthers. Supporting them were 80 self-propelled assault guns. In total, 262 armored fighting vehicles. Facing them was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark. On paper, CCA was outnumbered and outgunned. They had roughly 60 tanks. What the Germans didn't know was that some of those Shermans had just received a few precious HVAP rounds. September 18th dawned with heavy fog blanketing the Lorraine countryside. German columns moved forward, confident their armor would carry the day. The first engagement happened near Lunéville. American tank destroyers and Shermans, guided by better intelligence, had set up ambush positions. When Panthers emerged from the fog, they found American guns already aimed at their flanks. 24 German armored vehicles burned by the end of the day. General Hasso von Manteuffel didn't let the setback deter him. He ordered his forces to bypass Lunéville and strike north toward Arracourt, where Combat Command A held a more exposed position. The Panther brigades were brand new. Their tanks were modern, but their crews had almost no combat experience. The veterans of the 11th Panzer Division were experienced, but exhausted and under strength. Coordination between the two forces was poor. American forces, by contrast, knew the ground intimately. The 4th Armored Division had been operating in Lorraine for weeks. Officers had scouted every ridge, every approach route. Colonel Clark positioned his tanks on terrain of his choosing, forcing the Germans to attack uphill or across open ground. When German Panthers first appeared through the fog on the morning of September 20th, they advanced confidently. Crews had been told that American Shermans couldn't hurt them frontally, so they came forward in column, convinced they'd sweep aside any resistance. American tank commanders watched the Panthers advance. They held fire, waiting. The Germans kept coming. 800 yards. 600. Then the Americans opened fire. The sound of 76mm guns echoed across the hills, and for the first time, HVAP rounds flew toward Panthers from Shermans positioned on elevated defensive ground. The first Panther took a hit to its turret front. The shell didn't bounce. It punched through. Flames erupted from the commander's hatch. The tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from every opening. German crews in nearby Panthers froze in confusion. That wasn't supposed to happen. Before they could react, more HVAP rounds found targets. A second Panther exploded. A third took a hit to the gun mantlet. Panic rippled through the German formation. Panther commanders who'd been advancing confidently suddenly threw their tanks into reverse. But the terrain worked against them. Some bogged, others exposed their vulnerable belly plates. American gunners poured fire into the German formation. More Panthers burned. The 111th Panzer Brigade's first major attack dissolved into chaos. 5 Panthers were destroyed by direct fire from Shermans. 5 more were damaged and had to withdraw. The Germans had expected to overwhelm the Americans through sheer weight of armor. Instead, they'd run into a buzzsaw. German after-action reports from September 20th describe confusion and disbelief. Panther commanders reported taking hits from Sherman guns at ranges they believed safe. They described rounds that didn't bounce off but instead penetrated with catastrophic results. Officers demanded explanations. American crews, meanwhile, experienced elation. Tankers who'd spent months feeling helpless against Panthers suddenly had a weapon that worked. They watched German tanks explode under their fire. The psychological shift was enormous. Confidence soared. The predator-prey relationship had reversed. The fighting intensified over the next several days. German forces launched attack after attack, but American defensive positions held. Every time German armor advanced across open ground, American guns were waiting. On September 21st, the weather cleared enough for American fighter bombers to enter the battle. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed down on German tank columns. The combination of air attacks and ground fire was devastating. By September 24th, the fighting had moved to Chateau Salins. American fighter bombers broke a German infantry assault. The next day, Third Army received orders to suspend offensive operations. The 4th Armored Division shifted to full defense. 5th Panzer Army, now reduced to only 25 operational Panthers from the 107 it had started with, pressed weak attacks for 3 more days. But the counter-offensive was finished. On September 29th, German forces began withdrawing toward the German frontier. The Battle of Arracourt was over. The numbers told a stark story. Of the 262 German armored vehicles committed, only 62 remained operational. American losses stood at 48 tanks total. The lopsided ratio shocked observers on both sides. German commanders scrambled for explanations. After-action reports blamed poor weather, superior American air power, inexperienced crews, coordination failures. All of these were true, but buried in the reports were accounts of American shells penetrating Panther armor at previously safe ranges. What stunned German intelligence most was the realization that American tank guns hadn't been upgraded. When analysts examined the battlefield and recovered shell fragments, they identified standard 76mm gun markings. The answer, when it finally emerged, was sobering. The Americans had developed new ammunition, a tungsten-cored projectile that rendered Panther armor advantages partially obsolete. For American tankers, Arracourt proved that the HVAP round worked in combat. Under battlefield conditions, the tungsten penetrator delivered. Crews who'd received even a few HVAP rounds reported killing Panthers at ranges exceeding 500 yards, but the supply problem remained critical. Even after Arracourt, HVAP production couldn't meet demand. Distribution remained chaotic. By February of 1945, the average Sherman still had only 5 HVAP rounds. German forces adapted as best they could. Panther crews learned to avoid frontal engagements with Shermans when possible, staying hull down on ridges and engaging at maximum range. They added extra armor to turret faces, welding spare track links and sandbags onto vulnerable points. Field modifications proliferated as crews desperately sought any edge that might protect them from the new American ammunition. Some commanders ordered tanks to stay hauled down on ridges, exposing only their turrets to fire. Others used tanks like mobile bunkers, embedding them in defensive lines instead of sending them into open charges. But doctrine is one thing, reality in combat is another. When American forces attacked, German defenders couldn't always choose their engagement ranges or positions. Sometimes you fought where the enemy forced you to fight, and when that happened, when Panthers had to defend ground or counterattack across open terrain, the HVAP round was waiting. Psychological damage was harder to repair than armor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Once crews knew that Shermans could kill them frontally, the confidence that had sustained German tankers evaporated. Every time a Panther commander ordered his crew forward, he knew somewhere out there a Sherman with HVAP might be waiting, invisible until the first rockets streaked toward him. And every time an American squad advanced, they knew they weren't helpless. The HVAP turned the battlefield from one of fear to one of opportunity. That shift in confidence changed the flow of combat across Lorraine. American units began reorganizing their tactics around HVAP availability. Instead of treating the weapon as optional gear, they built whole fire teams around it. Tanks with HVAP acted as designated Panther killers, while tanks with only standard ammunition provided suppressive fire and engaged softer targets. The scarcity forced creativity. Some units pooled their HVAP ammunition, concentrating it in the hands of their best gunners. Crews learned to improvise and adapt. One Marine unit reported that during a single week in late September, their tanks destroyed more than a dozen Panthers that had tried to break through American lines. Another Army report praised the weapon for its role not just against tanks, but against fortifications. When a bunker or pillbox refused to fall to rifle fire, an HVAP rocket could blast its entrance apart. The Battle of Arracourt marked a turning point not because it introduced the HVAP round, but because it demonstrated its effectiveness at scale. This wasn't a laboratory test or a single lucky shot. This was an 11-day battle where American forces systematically destroyed German armor that should have been untouchable. The Germans had invested enormous resources in the Panther and relied on its technological superiority, now faced a problem they couldn't easily solve. The Americans had countered their best tank without building a new one. Tank destroyers fared particularly well with HVAP. The M18 Hellcat, mounting the same 76mm gun as the Sherman but in a lighter, faster chassis, became a feared Panther hunter. On September 18th near Lunéville, M18s from the 603 and 704 tank destroyer battalions destroyed 8 Panthers with no losses of their own using HVAP ammunition. The kills were clean, professional, and shocking to German observers who'd grown accustomed to their armor providing sanctuary. American after-action reports from Arracourt described the effect of HVAP in stark terms. One tank battalion commander wrote that the ammunition transformed his unit's effectiveness against German armor. Before receiving HVAP, his crews engaged Panthers with dread, knowing their standard rounds were inadequate. After receiving even a few HVAP rounds per tank, morale soared. Crews actively sought out Panther engagements instead of avoiding them. The tactical implications rippled through American armored units. Tank battalions that had operated cautiously, avoiding Panther encounters when possible, now pressed attacks more aggressively. The psychological edge shifted. American crews still respected the Panther as a dangerous opponent, but they no longer feared it as an invincible death machine. If you had HVAP ammunition and a clear shot, you could win. That knowledge transformed how units fought across the European theatre. December 16, 1944. Before dawn, German artillery opened up across a 60-mile front in the Ardennes. Thousands of shells rained down on American positions. Behind the barrage came tanks, hundreds of them, including Panthers, Tigers, and the fearsome King Tigers, with their near-impenetrable frontal armor. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate gamble in the West, had begun. American forces, many of them inexperienced units recuperating in what was supposed to be a quiet sector, reeled under the assault. German tanks punched deep into American lines, exploiting gaps and causing chaos in rear areas. For the first few days, it seemed like the German offensive might succeed. Units were cut off, supply lines severed, entire regiments surrounded. Panic spread through some headquarters as the scale of the German attack became clear. But as the initial shock wore off, American forces began to respond with the resilience that would define their performance throughout the war. Tank and tank destroyer units rushed north toward the bulge. Among them were battalions equipped with 76mm Shermans, and this time they had HVAP ammunition. Not a lot. The supply situation was still far from ideal, but enough to matter. The battles that erupted across Belgium and Luxembourg in late December would prove whether the lessons of Arracourt translated to winter warfare against Germany's most desperate and determined offensive. Near the town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne and attached armour units held out against German encirclement, tank destroyer crews with HVAP rounds became crucial to the defence. When Panthers approached the perimeter, attempting to break through and crush the defenders, American guns were ready. The tungsten penetrators punched through turret armour at ranges that shocked German crews who thought they were attacking soft infantry positions. Several Panthers burned within sight of Bastogne's church spire, victims of tank destroyers that shouldn't have been able to threaten them at those distances. The defenders of Bastogne became legends, but their success owed much to the fact that German armour couldn't simply roll over them. Every Panther that approached the perimeter risked destruction from HVAP-armed tank destroyers positioned in carefully prepared positions. The psychological weight of that threat slowed German attacks, bought time for American reinforcements, and ultimately contributed to Bastogne's successful defence. Further north, near Street, Vith, American armour engaged German forces in desperate fighting across snow-covered hills. 76mm Shermans with HVAP ammunition duelled with Panthers in conditions that favoured neither side. Visibility was poor in the winter weather. Footing was treacherous on icy roads. Crews fought in temperatures well below freezing, struggling with frozen mechanisms and numb fingers. But when American gunners got clear shots through the snow and fog, the tungsten rounds delivered. Reports from the Street, Vith sector describe multiple Panthers destroyed by frontal hits, something that would have been nearly impossible just 6 months earlier with standard ammunition. The psychological impact on German crews was pronounced and measurable. Panther commanders who'd participated in earlier offensives, who remembered when Shermans were helpless against their armour, now approached every engagement with caution bordering on fear. They'd heard stories from survivors of Arracourt. They'd seen Panthers in their own units burn from Sherman fire. The invincibility that had defined German armour doctrine was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty about whether the next American tank they encountered would have the ammunition to kill them. One captured German tank commander, interrogated after his Panther was knocked out near Houffalize, described the shift in stark psychological terms. He'd fought Shermans in Normandy with confidence. His armour had shrugged off their shells. He'd felt safe, even dominant, able to engage American tanks at will. But in the bulge, every time he saw a Sherman, he wondered if it carried the special ammunition. That uncertainty ate at him. He second-guessed his tactics. He hesitated when he should have advanced aggressively, and ultimately, an American 76mm HVAP round ended his war, penetrating his turret and killing his gunner. The Battle of the Bulge raged through Christmas and into early January of 1945. American forces, reinforced and resupplied as Patton's Third Army drove north to relieve Bastogne, pushed back against the German salient. Air power, grounded during the initial assault by the worst weather in decades, returned with devastating effect once the skies cleared after Christmas. German tanks that survived American ground fire fell victim to fighter bombers carrying rockets and bombs. Fuel shortages crippled German mobility, leaving Panthers abandoned by roadsides. And everywhere, American firepower proved more effective than German intelligence had predicted. The combination of HVAP ammunition and improved tactics meant that German armour advantages eroded steadily throughout the battle. American tankers who might have fled Panther encounters in summer now stood their ground and fought. The knowledge that they had ammunition capable of defeating Panthers frontally gave crews confidence to hold defensive positions and engage at ranges where their fire was effective. By the time the Bulge was eliminated in late January, German armoured forces were shattered beyond recovery. The offensive had cost them over 800 tanks they couldn't replace, tens of thousands of gallons of fuel they didn't have, and men whose training and experience couldn't be replicated. American forces, by contrast, emerged from the battle battered but intact. Their casualties were heavy, yes, over 70,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. But their supply lines remained functional. Their factories kept producing tanks and ammunition at rates Germany could never match. And their crews had proven they could fight Germany's best armor in the worst conditions and win. American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, breaching the last major natural barrier protecting Germany. German tank units, starved of fuel and replacements, could only conduct defensive actions from static positions. Panthers became increasingly rare on the battlefield, not because they weren't effective weapons, but because there weren't enough of them left and no fuel to move the ones that remained. The few that remained operational fought stubbornly, their crews knowing the war was lost but fighting on anyway. American 76mm Shermans pressed forward across Germany, now confident in their ability to engage any German armor they encountered. HVAP ammunition, while still not as plentiful as commanders would have liked, was more available than during the dark days of autumn. Tank battalions typically carried 10 to 15 rounds per gun by the war's final months. Not enough for sustained combat against massed armor, but sufficient for the sporadic encounters with dug-in Panthers that characterized the final advance into Germany. The final battles in Germany saw Panthers dug in as static pillboxes, their mobility sacrificed to conserve the last precious drops of fuel. American tanks engaged them at ranges where HVAP was most effective, methodically destroying them one by one. The tactical equation had fully reversed from the early days in Normandy. What began as German superiority in armor and firepower, with Panthers dominating the battlefield, ended with American forces hunting Panthers like prey. The predator had become the hunted, and German tankers knew it. German tank crews who survived the war and were later interviewed by historians and researchers spoke of the HVAP round with something approaching awe, mixed with bitterness. They'd been trained to believe German engineering was superior, that their armor and guns gave them decisive advantages that would secure victory. The Panther embodied that belief. It was supposed to be the tank that secured victory in the east and held back the tide in the west, a technological masterpiece that proved German superiority. But American ingenuity, embodied in a tungsten-cored shell developed under wartime pressure, had negated much of that advantage. One veteran Panther commander, interviewed decades later for a documentary, described the psychological blow with remarkable candor. "We thought we were safe in our Panthers. The armor was thick, the gun was powerful, the optics were excellent. Everything we'd been told suggested we were superior to American tanks in every way. But then the Americans started killing us from the front. At first we didn't believe the reports. We thought they were lies from frightened crews. Then we saw it happening with our own eyes. Tank after tank in our unit, destroyed by Sherman fire that should have bounced off harmlessly. It changed everything about how we fought. We stopped feeling invincible and started feeling vulnerable. And once that happened, we'd already lost the psychological war. The tanks were still good, but we no longer believed in them. The technical specifications tell part of the story, but only part. The HVAP round could penetrate 7 inches of armor at 1,000 meters, roughly 178 millimeters by the metric measurements German engineers used. The Panther's turret face, measured 100 millimeters thick, sloped at modest angles compared to the extreme slope of the glacis. The math worked decisively in favor of penetration at combat ranges. Hit a Panther in the turret and you disabled or destroyed it. That simple calculation changed the battlefield calculus for both sides. But raw specifications don't capture the human element that defined the HVAP's impact. The fear in a Panther commander's voice as he reported Sherman tanks ahead, knowing they might carry the ammunition that could kill him. The relief trembling in an American gunner's hands as he carefully loaded an HVAP round, knowing he had a fighting chance for the first time in months. The disbelief in German intelligence reports that tried desperately to explain how American tanks were suddenly so dangerous. The pride in American factory workers, many of them women, who'd manufactured the tungsten cores under impossible deadlines in crowded facilities. War is ultimately about people, and the HVAP round's impact was as much psychological as kinetic. The aftermath of the war brought assessments and analysis from both sides. American after-action reports praised the HVAP rounds' effectiveness when available, while strongly criticizing the supply situation that left so many units without adequate stocks. Military analysts argued that if more rounds had been available earlier, particularly during the summer and fall of 1944, American tank losses might have been significantly lower. But tungsten scarcity was a strategic reality that couldn't be wished away or easily overcome. The United States had prioritized aviation and industrial uses for tungsten, accepting that armor-piercing ammunition would remain limited. In hindsight, with the luxury of knowing the war's outcome, that priority seems questionable and worthy of debate. But in the context of 1944, with the outcome still uncertain and resources stretched thin across multiple theaters, it reflected the hard choices about resource allocation that all combatants faced. German post-war reports took a different tone, one of grudging respect mixed with frustration. Technical analyses marveled at American manufacturing capability and the speed with which new weapons were developed and fielded. The precision required to produce tungsten carbide cores to exact specifications, the metallurgy needed to bond aluminum bodies to steel bases without compromising structural integrity, the quality control necessary to ensure reliable performance under combat conditions, all spoke to industrial sophistication that Germany couldn't match in its deteriorating strategic situation. One German engineer's report, captured after the war, concluded, simply and matter-of-factly, that American technical capability and industrial capacity had been systematically underestimated across the board, with catastrophic results for German military planning. The HVAP round's legacy extended far beyond World War II, influencing ammunition development for decades to come. Post-war weapons programs built directly on its principles and lessons. The Korean War, which erupted just 5 years after World War II ended, saw Sherman tanks equipped with improved versions of the HVAP, now designated M319, which featured even better penetration thanks to refined propellant powders and improved manufacturing techniques. American Shermans in Korea, using this advanced ammunition and benefiting from superior crew training, destroyed Soviet-supplied T-34-85s with relative ease, validating the ammunition's continuing effectiveness. Soviet forces, who'd received thousands of 76mm Shermans through Lend-Lease during World War II, praised the tank's reliability and firepower in their post-war assessments. Soviet tanker Dmitry Loza later wrote extensively about his experiences with the Sherman, noting that when supplied with American ammunition, including HVAP, the tank was highly effective against German armor, despite its reputation as inferior. The Soviets appreciated what American crews had learned through bitter experience. Properly armed with the right ammunition, the Sherman was a capable tank killer that could hold its own against much heavier opponents. The technical innovation represented by HVAP influenced post-war anti-tank ammunition development worldwide and became standard practice in military arsenals. The concept of sub-caliber penetrators became the dominant paradigm for armor-piercing ammunition design. Modern armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding saber rounds, used by every major military today from the United States to Russia to China, trace their lineage directly back to World War II. Developments like the HVAP and British APDS. The principle remains fundamentally unchanged across 8 decades. A small, dense penetrator, moving at extremely high velocity, defeats armor that would stop larger, slower projectiles. The physics haven't changed, only the materials and manufacturing precision have improved. But perhaps the most important legacy, the one that echoes through military planning and doctrine to this day, was psychological and strategic. The HVAP round proved that technological superiority isn't permanent and advantages can evaporate quickly. The Germans had built the Panther as a response to the Soviet T-34, creating a tank that outclassed most Allied armor in its weight class. They'd assumed this advantage would last long enough to make a strategic difference. American engineers, working under intense pressure with limited resources, found a way to counter it without building an entirely new tank from scratch. A new type of ammunition, rushed from concept to production to battlefield deployment in a matter of months, shifted the balance decisively. That lesson resonated through military planning for decades after the war ended. Adversaries will adapt to your advantages. Today's superiority becomes tomorrow's parity if you don't keep innovating. The side that innovates faster, that gets new capabilities into the field quicker, gains decisive edges that can determine campaign outcomes. The HVAP round's deployment timeline from August through December of 1944 demonstrated the critical importance of rapid fielding. Those months, when the ammunition was scarce but present in forward units, saw American tank crews transition from fear of Panthers to confidence in engaging them. That psychological shift was worth divisions in combat power. The human stories embedded in this broader technical narrative deserve remembering and honoring. Tank crews who climbed into Shermans every morning knowing they were outgunned, but fighting anyway, trusting their training and their comrades. Engineers who worked around the clock in factories to manufacture tungsten cores under wartime constraints with quality control personnel breathing down their necks. Supply officers who made impossible decisions about which units received precious HVAP rounds and which went without, knowing their choices might determine who lived and who died. German tankers who watched their technological advantage slip away month by month, their faith in German engineering slowly eroding. All of them were caught in the grinding logic of industrial warfare, where innovation and production capacity mattered as much as courage and tactical skill. One American tanker, interviewed 50 years after the war ended, summed up the HVAP's impact with simple eloquence that captured what the ammunition meant to the men who used it. Before we got it, seeing a Panther meant running or dying. Those were your only two choices, and neither was good. After we got it, seeing a Panther meant we had a chance to fight back. That's all we ever wanted, a fighting chance to defend ourselves. The HVAP gave us that. It didn't make us invincible or turn our Shermans into supertanks. It just gave us a chance. His words capture the essence of the weapon's significance. It wasn't about making the Sherman equal to the Panther in all respects, achieving perfect parity. It was about closing the gap enough that crew skill, tactics, numerical superiority, and combined arms could decide engagements instead of armor thickness alone dictating outcomes. By war's end, in May of 1945, the 76mm HVAP round had become standard issue for units equipped with the gun. Production had ramped up sufficiently that supply constraints, while never completely eliminated, were far less critical than during the desperate months of late 1944. American tank crews rolling into Germany in the final weeks of the war carried adequate HVAP loads for expected combat. They no longer had to ration each shot or save the precious ammunition for only the most desperate moments. The scarcity that defined autumn of 1944 was finally over, though it had come too late for many crews who'd fought and died without the ammunition they needed. The story of the 76mm HVAP round encapsulates several enduring truths about warfare, technology, and innovation that remain relevant today. Innovation matters enormously, but implementation and distribution matter just as much. The HVAP was useless sitting in American depots or warehouses, while tank crews fought Panthers with inadequate ammunition in the field. Getting it to the front lines, even in limited quantities that fell short of ideal, transformed battles and saved lives. Speed of deployment can be as important as quality of design in determining military effectiveness. For the soldiers who fought with and against the HVAP round on battlefields from Lorraine to the Ardennes to Germany, the technical details and post-war analyses mattered far less than practical reality in the moment. American crews knew one simple fact: if they had HVAP and saw a Panther, they could fight back with a reasonable chance of survival and victory. German crews knew the inverse. American Shermans were no longer helpless victims waiting to be destroyed. That fundamental shift in battlefield reality, driven by a tungsten-cored projectile, developed under wartime urgency and fielded despite enormous logistical challenges, changed the character of armored warfare during the last year of the war in Western Europe. The German High Command's failure to anticipate American ammunition development reveals a broader intelligence failure. They'd underestimated American industrial capability and technical sophistication. The assumption that German engineering was inherently superior blinded them to the possibility that American engineers might solve the Panther problem through ammunition rather than new tanks. Veterans of both sides remembered the HVAP for different reasons. American tankers recalled it as the weapon that evened the odds. German tankers remembered it as the beginning of the end, the moment when they realized that Allied material superiority extended even to ammunition technology. Both perspectives capture truth. The story ends not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual shift. By spring of 1945, American tank units had sufficient HVAP to engage any threat. The desperate shortage of autumn was past. Panthers, when encountered, were destroyed methodically. The thunder that had begun at Arracourt continued across Germany until German resistance collapsed. It wasn't the biggest gun, it wasn't the thickest armor, it was a tungsten cord projectile that transformed a medium tank gun into a Panther killer. Simple in concept, challenging in execution, and devastating in effect. German commanders who mocked American firepower in summer of 1944 had learned by winter that mockery was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Panther's invincibility was an illusion, and the HVAP round was the hard truth that shattered it. From the fog-shrouded fields of Arracourt to the rubble-choked streets of German cities, the 76mm HVAP round proved that in war, adaptation beats superiority. The Germans had built a better tank, the Americans had built a better bullet, and in the end, the bullet was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.